And now I'm very much pleased to give the floor to our second speaker, Vojko Stahovnik, who will be talking about diffeasibility. The title of his paper is "What does the notion of prima facie duty have to do with feasibility?"
Thank you. I'll just ask you if you could press this handout. Thank you for being here. I've just prepared some handout with some basic quotes from the theory that I will be discussing, because the hotel informed us that the power supply might get a bit shaky around 11 o'clock because there's a reconstruction works because of the floods around here. So I said I will not risk my chances with the PowerPoint and do it the traditional way. I would like to thank Seppo for doing a really nice introductory paper to also set the floor for what I'm going to say in a way. I'm returning to the topic of this diffeasibility, the one that I dealt the last year, and I have to apologize for that. But I will do it from another perspective. What's the reason for that? Recently I wrote a review of the book that just came out. The book is titled The Logic of Legal Requirements, Essays on Diffeasibility. And there I found that at least like 7 or 8 contributors sees Ross' theory of prima facie duty, which was set up in the Moore theory in the 1930s, as one of the origins of diffeasibility or ideas of diffeasibility or even models of diffeasibility. For example, authors like Redondo, Professor Sartor, who was already here, Caracciolo, if the pronunciation is right, and several others made this claim. I will try to argue that at least in one of the more central senses of diffeasibility, the one that is closely connected with the notion of an exception, prima facie duty, at least in the sense that Ross understands them, are clearly not defeasible. This conceptual confusion surrounding the notion of prima facie duty is not surprising, since even within moral philosophy there is a broad variety of interpretations and some clear misinterpretations of prima facie duty. I will propose that what is according to me the most plausible interpretation and also the most faithful to the work of Ross, and it will relate to the notion of a basic moral reason. I will then quickly look at what consequence this had for the diffeasibility debate. Okay. So first, a short note of diffeasibility as I see it. What do we mean when we say that something, for example, a given norm, standard, reasoning or concept is defeasible? Well, if you're interested in the diffeasibility, then there are several approaches and possible questions to them that we can pose. First, there's the question about the subjects of diffeasibility, and there's a whole range of candidates. We have defeasible concepts, norms, rules, standards, principles, reasonings, facts, beliefs, claims, conclusions, arrangements, etc. It goes on and on. But the next set of questions is related to the sources of diffeasibility, the nature of diffeasibility, and the scope of diffeasibility. And the last set of questions deals with what consequences diffeasibility brings for both legal theory and practice. Well, my approach was just to try to come closer to the notion of this diffeasibility by looking at the most common characterizations, or we can almost say platitudes, about diffeasibility that accompany it. I will just focus on the diffeasibility of norms, but similar can be said about other subjects of diffeasibility. So if you look at the common characterization and platitudes about diffeasibility, there's a long list. I will go through it quickly. A diffeasible norm allows for exceptions. A norm is diffeasible if it allows exceptions. That means if there are cases that should or appear to be governed by the norm, but are in fact not. The second point is indeterminacy. A diffeasible norm is indeterminate in the sense that the rule or a set of rules does not provide a determinate normative solution in every case. Well, the third notion that diffeasibility is closely related is vagueness. Vagueness is often linked with diffeasibility in the sense that the norm is vague if it is ambiguous, either as a whole or a given part of it is ambiguous, and this can lead to diffeasibility. Well, and there are several more particular aspects of diffeasibility that gets mentioned. The first one is that the diffeasible norm is somehow still there, is somehow still in play, even when defeated or overridden or when an exception is made. So it somehow still determines the normative space in this situation, affecting the final normative solution or some circumstances that accompany it. It could affect, but not necessary. The next one is that a diffeasible norm stays the same even when it faces an exception. So it survived the point of exception, still applies in other cases that follows. We don't just change the norm, for example, to make it more determinate or more exact, and this norm is not feasible. Or that's not the hard problem about feasibility. And then you have a bunch of approaches that say, well, a norm is defeasible if it only holds in normal, usual, ordinary, or paradigmatic cases. Of course, the question remains how you can spell out this notion of normalcy. You can leave that aside. Then, a defeasible norm requires interpretation before application to a particular case. The next platitude. Next, a defeasible norm is not a mere case of improper or unclear formulation. A defeasible norm is somehow associated with the open texture in the hard sense, that it's impossible to formulate clear, necessary, and sufficient conditions for the application of a given norm. And I think next point is important. A defeasible norm is not just something that we use as a rule of thumb, because we formulate some sort of rule of thumbs with an intention for them to be defeasible. We know that we're just some sort of an aid or a heuristic device that helps us, but we presuppose that some sort of defeasibility and exceptions to such kinds of norms. A defeasible norm can be subject to later revisions, it's sometimes claimed, so defeasibility in the sense of revisability. A defeasible norm can be subject to implicit or explicit conditions in the form of a, let's say, unless clause. So, if A, then B ought to be unless X, Y, Z, etc. And a defeasible norm can have a limited domain of application in the form of it only holds in these cases with these circumstances, and that's it. So, or others, will not get decided within this. So, what can we take as central from these characteristics or platitudes, or at least what I would wish to claim that it's central for defeasibility? I think that we can view it from two basic characteristics. The first has to do with the notion of exception. Exception in the sense that a defeasible norm allow for, sometimes it's called something like true exception, and nonetheless survives and remains the same even after this exception is made. A true or genuine exception is an exception that cannot be specified in advance, so there is a sort of an open-ended divisibility. And the norm stays the same. That means that the exceptional case doesn't get built into the norm afterwards, changing it, modifying it. And the second characteristic that I think is important in this regard is that the exception made is not a mere case of overruling by another norm, more or less of the same kind. That is, in this particular case, judged to be more stringent or weightier or important. In its practical consequences, where does this two characteristics bring us? I think that it brings us closely to the authors who wish to view divisibility as associated with this kind of normalcy or paradigmatic cases or ordinary cases. But I somehow left this aside because of the problems of specifying it. Well, now, this understanding that I presented might be too narrow. Somebody could claim that unjustifiably so, since a more common, close-end set of negative conditions for a given norm would also make it divisible. For example, a norm, one is liable if one voluntarily causes damage, except if one acts in a state of emergency. So, this is clearly a norm, it states an exception to it, but I think if we regard this kind of norms as divisible, we are avoiding the hard problem about divisibility. I'm prepared to include such norms within the divisibility set, but I think that we are avoiding the hard problem. This is the norms that the exceptions are not spelled out explicitly or in advance and cannot be. So, with this understanding in mind, our prima facie duty is divisible then, at least in this sense. Well, as I said, the theory of prima facie duty gets developed in Ross' book, The Right and the Good, from the 1930s, and I put on the handout the very famous quote that every introductory book on ethics usually holds, and everybody knows it, his characterization of prima facie duty. So Ross says, I suggest prima facie duty or conditional duty as a brief way of referring to the characteristics distinct from that being of a duty proper, which an act has in virtue of being of a certain kind. For example, the keeping of a promise. Or being an act which would be a duty proper if it were not at the same time of another kind, which is morally significant. Whether an act is a duty proper or actual duty depends on all the morally significant kinds it is an instance of. Well, this short passage has been quoted over and over again, analyzed, interpreted, not always true to the spirit of what Ross was claiming. Of course, Ross takes part of the blame for this, since he was not particularly clear on this issue. That's why some authors like John Searle just said it's better just to give up the notion of prima facie obligation or prima facie duty, use other notions, because it's just a mess. You cannot get anything from it. What is, of course, important that this short passage is a part of a larger context in which Ross works, and that he made several attempts to clarify this notion, specify it, and make it more clear. For example, in the next passage, he says, he specifies two kinds of understanding that are not to be associated with it. He says, prima facie could suggest that what we are speaking is a certain kind of duty, whereas it is in fact not a duty, but something related in a special way to duty. And secondly, prima facie suggests that one is speaking only of an appearance, which a moral situation presents at first sight, and which may turn out to be illusory, whereas I'm speaking of is an objective fact involved in the nature, though not as a duty proper arising from its whole nature. So, Prima facie duties are not duties proper, and they are not merely some sort of appearances that we meet some certain case, and then at first sight we would wish to classify it as a more significant, but when we look into the details we see, well, there's basically nothing here, we must go some other way. And then there are several other passages I just put out. I think number 3 is important. Ross says, there's nothing arbitrary about these prima facie duties. Each rests on a definite circumstance which cannot seriously be held without moral significance. Which are those prima facie duties that Ross states? There are 7 of them: fidelity, reparation, gratitude, justice, beneficence, self-improvement, and non-beneficence. So those are basic prima facie duties. And if you look at his other book, The Foundation of Ethics, he makes an analogy with forces and natural laws. He sometimes uses the term claim instead of a prima facie duty, and he sometimes uses the term responsibility, but he's not happy with either of them, so he was oscillating a bit in this manner. My proposal how to interpret this theory is the following. I'll just read it more quickly through it because I only have 5 minutes more. In order to approach the proper interpretation of prima facie duties, we must first acknowledge that Ross introduces them in chapter 2, titled What Makes X Right, and which is the basis for his moral pluralism. Moral theories try to search for universally morally relevant properties or features, or for grounding features of those universally morally relevant properties of actions. Once such features are found, they can then figure as a basis for formulation of moral principles and rules. Ross' moral pluralism based on prima facie duty is no exception in this respect. Prima facie duties identify such universally morally relevant features of our actions. Russian-style moral pluralism is different in the description of the role that such moral principles based on prima facie duties play when determining our final duty. Our actual or final duty or overall deontic status of our action cannot be simply deduced from this relatively close set of prima facie duties, since a prima facie duty only identifies universally morally relevant features. It does not give us actual direction what to do, and neither some fixed rankings of the relative importance or absolute importance of particular duties. This theory is pluralistic in the sense that it posits a plurality of basic and mutually irreducible moral grounds of obligations that do not come in a strict order of importance. For this plurality to avoid direct and irresolvable conflicts, Ross introduced the notion of prima facie duty. So the role of the notion of prima facie duty was first and foremost to get a workable pluralistic framework for his intuitionism. But what was meant as a solution to the problem seemed to have generated even more troubles, even more problems. One can find a plethora of different interpretations of prima facie duties, besides the ones that already pointed out. For example, there are several epistemic understandings in terms of appearances. Then we have a counterfactual understandings, ceteris paribus understandings, statistical understandings, conditional understandings, metaphysical understandings in terms of moral forces, in terms of moral reasons. I prefer the latter. I think that most of other understandings can be dismissed, either dismissed as misinterpretation or included within the interpretation of prima facie duties as basic moral reasons. It seems plausible to adopt a proposal that prima facie duties represent basic moral reasons. Ross' concept of prima facie duty must be read metaphysically and normatively and not epistemically. A certain act is our prima facie duty if, as a part of its nature, there is a certain feature X which is so basic in our moral lives that it carries a universal moral relevance. Prima facie duty always offers a good moral reason, but not necessarily a conclusive one. Our good moral judgment is therefore very important in determining what our actual duty or duty proper is. As Ross says, quoting Aristotle, for the rest, the decision rests with perception, so with good judgment. So, in this slide, are prima facie duties defeasible then? Well, it depends on what kind of norms you get out of prima facie duties. Well, one attempt, we saw that the notion of a norm can be also very problematic. One attempt is just to stay with reasons and said, well, there's some basic kind of normative consequences of prima facie duties, and those is, for example, not a clear formulation, if an action A is an instance of a D, D being a prima facie duty, then we have good normative reason to do or avoid A, depending on the nature of the duty. And then, if we go to the level of moral rightness, if an action is an instance of D, and D is our prima facie duty, it is morally right in this respect, and also morally right overall, insofar D is the only prima facie duty present, or none of the other prima facie duties are morally more important than D. And we can also go to the level of obligation. An action A is an instance of D. If an action A is an instance of D, and D is our prima facie duty, D is also our overall duty if D is the only prima facie duty, or other prima facie duty are present but do not override or defeat the moral import of D. So are those or similar norms that can get constructed defeasible? Well, norms, interpretation is connected with moral reasons, are clearly not defeasible. They do not allow for any exceptions. If prima facie duties are understood as basic moral reasons, then wherever they are present, whenever they are instantiated, they are morally relevant. They determine the normative space. They might not lead to our final obligation, but they may perhaps affect the way we carry out this obligation, or they may affect a sort of additional duty that we have following our performance of an obligation. For example, if I have a conflict between helping a friend in distress or keeping with my promise, and I decide that helping a friend is more important, and I break the promise that I made, I have some additional duty to apologize or to make some reparation for the promise that I broke in this given case. Well, norms specifying what is moral right to do on the basis of moral prima facie duties are, according to my understanding, also not defeasible, since they do not allow for exception. They clearly state the negative conditions that have to be met when a prima facie duty becomes a moral right action. And the same goes when a prima facie duty becomes our actual duty and is a status of obligatory here. But one could say, well, but there's a further possibility. What about the defeasibility of the whole system of norms? Is the whole system defeasible? Well, the last proposal is that the whole system of norms is defeasible in the sense that it does not provide us with a determinate normative solutions for every case. But I think that the indeterminacy and defeasibility are not one and the same thing. Secondly, this kind of indeterminacy is merely a consequence of Ross pluralism. In a sense, therefore, the system as a whole can be seen as defeasible, but with clear understanding that what we mean by it is indeterminate. This last consideration is a consequence of the approach to morality and moral theory that is at the heart of Ross theory and similar theories, that highly value our ordinary moral experience and its phenomenology, and thus put systematicity and determinacy of moral theory as secondary consideration to that. I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much.